Welcome to the first Oikocredit US webinar focused on the US impact investing market. Today, we have Dr. Kirsten Andersen joining us to discuss the role foundations play in the impact investing market. Kirsten is the resident sociologist and engaged research expert at Impacto Consulting. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Illinois at Chicago, where her dissertation examined US charitable foundation impact investments. Dr. Andersen's research on foundations explores three different areas. One, how foundation impact investors determine what was enough or the right kind of return for their impact investments. Two, the relationship between social and financial returns of impact investments. And three, the external economic and legal forces that affect impact investing in the US. Welcome, Kirsten. We look forward to hearing your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Heather, for the introduction, and thank you, Kirsten, for joining us. So today we're focusing on the role that foundations play in impact investing. We think of foundations as huge philanthropic players. They make grants, but they do a lot of different things. And foundations actually aren't all large. There's some really small family foundations, as well as kind of the huge foundations that many of us know the names of. So just to start the conversation, I wanted to better understand what the actual kind of dollar role that foundations play in impact investing, at least here in the US. So I looked at the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network's information. So they, in 2019, sized the impact investing market. They looked at 1,340 organizations who collectively manage $502 billion in impact investments. About 2% of those, or around 30, were foundations, and they represent also 2% of that total assets under management. So that's about $10 billion. So that's the closest kind of guess we have of what foundations, especially here in the US. I don't think that that was kind of exclusive to the US, but most of those foundations are in the US. So we're looking at about $10 billion from foundations into the impact investing space. The other kind of piece, which we're probably going to talk extensively about today, of that total is PRI, or program-related investments. In a few moments, I'm going to ask Kirsten to talk about program-related investments and mission-related investments and what the difference is, but program-related investments, or shortened PRI, is something that we hear a lot about. And I was really interested in what the actual scale of PRI is. And to be honest, the data is really sparse, which kind of surprised me. So some of the best information about the scale of PRIs is quite old. There was some pretty detailed information from 2000 to 2009, where the total dollar amount invested in PRIs grew from about 139 million to 701 million in 2009. And that number was outstanding. So not 701 million new investments in 2009, but that was kind of the total pool. Some information puts the percent of PRI as 1% of total distribution from foundations, which in 2019, total foundation giving was 76 billion. And so we can approximate that to be 450 million. That's an estimate. Again, there's just really poor data about PRI out there. Of course, we can talk to individual foundations, which Kirsten, you did, and we did as well. But that's kind of a nice number. So it's probably somewhere above 450 million, especially out of the US. So that's just sort of an intro, kind of what is the market. And of course, we're talking about impact investing. What even is impact investing? According to the GIN, it is investing for positive social and environmental impact, but they include some really specific language that I think is important, which is investments made with the intention to generate positive and measurable social and environmental impact alongside financial return. There's a wide range of financial return, from what we consider market-based, higher returns we might consider, or below market investments, which might actually be negative returns. And we'll talk a lot more about that here shortly. So it's kind of the world we're looking at. Large foundations, they make these impact investments. They make these things called PRIs, program-related investments, or MRIs. And yeah, we're going to talk more about what those actually are and what type of impact they make. So Kirsten, my first question to you is actually to sort of continue that conversation about what is impact investing. So you did some research that I'll ask about in a minute, but it was in the impact investing space. So how did you even define that, or what was your approach to defining impact investing?
Sure. Yeah. So I undertook this research. I started planning for it in 2017, and then did a series of 54 in-depth interviews in 2018 with representatives of foundations that were making impact investments, and then a group that I sort of refer to as field builders. So those are perhaps organizations that are helping foundations to make those investments, or are sort of building the market of impact investing through knowledge generation or things of that nature. And I ended up finding the sample of impact investors that I spoke with by sort of looking at the list of the investor council from the GIN. So again, sort of, the definition that you had talked about earlier of impact investing, and people who had, or foundations that had sort of publicly affiliated themselves with impact investing. So those were foundations that were thinking about making investments with the intention to also create some sort of specific social or environmental impact with them.
So tell us a little bit more about what you were looking for in your research, just from the outset. Why foundations? Why impact investing? What was kind of the question you were initially looking to answer?
Sure. So I ended up selecting foundations as the subset of impact investors that I was interested in, because in some respects, they've kind of always been in the business of both making financial returns and making social impact. They exist to fulfill a charitable mission, but they can do so because they have an endowment, and that has to be invested. So while those activities have mostly been sort of siloed until impact investing came along, foundations are sort of unique actors in the market because they've done more of that investment and social impact work. And so I was really curious to hear from them how they were deciding in a new market what were sort of the right amounts of returns that they wanted for their impact investing, what was the type of impact they wanted. So looking kind of at the quality as well as the quantity of those returns. And then I was really curious about whether they had thought of a relationship between the financial and the social components of their investments, because that's sort of what sets impact investing apart, if you will, from more traditional kinds of financial investments.
So on a really high level, what did you learn about how foundations are making impact investments?
Yeah. So, it's important to keep in mind that I didn't do an enormous survey. So I wouldn't, venture to say this is representative. It's a sample of 54, but they were interesting and in-depth interviews. So I would say from the sample that I spoke with, that I learned generally that there were really pretty strict thresholds as far as financial expectations went. And those varied by whether the investment was structured as a program-related investment or a mission-related investment. So we can talk about that. But so there was, really one kind of thinking that was applied to financial thresholds and returns. And then there was a very different sort of thinking regarding the social impact that was sought from those investments. And there wasn't really very much relationship between those two components. And I say that less to be critical. The market is incredibly new, and a lot of the foundations that I was speaking with were doing some of their very first impact investments at that time. So there really was no playbook for how to navigate those decisions in a standardized way. And that's what made it really interesting research. But yeah.
Yeah, what you just said sort of reminded me, when we were looking at foundations and we had a survey out, we talked to some foundations and we were asking about their impact investing. You mentioned that, you didn't do a survey of every foundation in the US, or it wasn't this huge analytical survey. At the same time, like you said, a lot of foundations are making their first impact investment. And so it's a field that requires more observation about different foundations doing different things as opposed to assumptions about here's how foundations are doing it. So I think we found very similar outcomes. Like you said, a lot of foundations, it really just falls into PRI. That's something that they've been doing a long time. Those program related investments is something that they're comfortable with. And it might just be in that bucket. We at least asked some more general questions about sustainable investing. A lot of investors now are not equating both, but are looking at both, and they kind of think of sustainable investments as having some impact, which, hypothetically, there's some maybe environmental or social impact associated with sustainable investing, or kind of having a lens around the social, environmental, or governance impacts of your investments. So anyways, it was interesting to hear that at least is certainly well known, common. There's a lot of investments that are being invested along that side. But yeah, the impact investments themselves, there's a smaller pool, there's a smaller bucket. It really does fit into that PRI pool. So can you tell us, what are PRIs, what are MRIs, why are they different, and what are both? There's actually some legal definitions, which is important, but in practice, what are those two pools actually doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So for charitable foundations in the US, they can be making impact investments from two separate sort of pots of money, if you will. So foundations are required to give away 5% every year to comply with what's required of them to keep their tax status. Program-related investments are often used or have been used sort of in tandem to support socially impactful work for nonprofits that a foundation has supported in other capacities through grants. And so they're expecting the capital back, but it's not necessarily an organization that's going to be able to return a market rate financial return to them. So that might be a context in which they would use that money in that way. And I had some respondents who talked to me about that money as being sort of recyclable, in the sense that that money was then able to be invested, but then they would know that it would come back to them. So that was some sort of interesting language from a couple of respondents. Whereas mission-related investments are a lot of times either a carve-out or a portion taken from a foundation's endowment. So it's the rest of the 95% of the foundation's assets from which they're made. And mission-related investments are interesting because they aren't defined clearly by the IRS in the same way that program-related investments are. And so if a mission for a foundation is to promote healthcare, for instance, one might argue that a mission-related investment could be an investment in any company that is, providing above average healthcare benefits, for instance, for their employees, right? Or it could be, a really socially impactful investment that, other sort of non-impact investors wouldn't be making. So there's kind of a range, and that's interesting. But also the sort of financial expectations of mission-related investments are usually that of the market rate. And I think that foundations think about mission-related investments as adhering to the same standards that the rest of their investments are adherent to as far as financial expectations go.
Okay, so if I have this correctly, mission-related investments come out of the endowment. In general, the expectation is that, say, the returns of those would match those of the rest of the endowment. So if you're targeting an 8% return on your endowment, you have a portfolio, some might be below, some might be high, but the mission-related definitely fits into those portfolio expectations. Whereas the program-related investments are coming out of the 5% that would otherwise go to grant making, and those can have and kind of are expected to have lower returns, although hypothetically they could end up having higher returns. Maybe you could invest equity that you expect to get back 1 or 2%, and they have some great years and you get whatever, more than that back. So, but those are the pools that they're coming from.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that with PRIs, it's sort of less about, PRIs are more about intention than they are about the actual financial return. And so, like you said, if you make more money, then it just gets reinvested in the PRI pot or the grant pot, right? And gets redistributed again.
So the conversation about mission-related investments, I think brings us to the next question, which is the definition around fiduciary duty kind of changed in 2015. Can you describe what that was and what that means for foundations when they're thinking about those mission-related investments or sort of other impactful investments that they might make out of their corpus?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it was 2006, UPMIFA, was approved, which is the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. And basically what that said was that foundations need to be acting as prudent investors, and the fiduciaries who are working there need to act as prudent investors, sort of in accordance with general theories of modern portfolio theory, right, where we're maximizing our returns and minimizing our risk. And so I think that's adopted in 49 states. It's sort of a state by state regulation, but it is across the United States pretty standard. And so I think that, initially from the way that foundations have discussed that, they seemed to feel sort of held back, right, or hesitant to make mission-related investments because they were worried it might be in violation of their fiduciary duty and their need to be prudent investors. And so in 2015, there were some, I don't know if it was necessarily changes so much, but illustrative examples of mission-related investments made, along with the, clear language that it is okay for foundations to invest in accordance with their charitable mission, as well as for financial return. So I think it was really meant to illustrate to foundations that they can feel like they can make mission-related investments and still be legitimate fiduciaries. And for my research, I think that was really interesting because what it demonstrated was that even when the sort of legitimacy that has been tied to the state, right, or to the IRS is lifted to some degree, that there's still hesitancy, right? And there's still legitimacy that is, sort of attached to the financial market, I think more generally, that foundations feel, sort of beholden to, if you will.
So that sort of brings up this question of what are the returns that are expected for an impact investment, right? If we were to limit the definition of impact investing to be market rate returns, but positive social or environmental impact, and there's plenty of those out there, then this wouldn't really even be a question, right? Because mission-related investments would always be trying to make market returns. But of course, there's this wide range of potential returns, everything from a grant, which is, could be considered a negative 100% return, to like a 0% loan or maybe a recoverable grant that has a 0% return and kind of everything in between. So there sometimes is this, I don't know if it's tension about impact versus return. Should impact investing be impact over return? Should it not? Did you find in your research that foundations were weighing that? Were they thinking about impact and return in connection? Were they thinking about it as two totally separate things?
Yeah. So I think what was interesting was that there was an incredible differentiation, even with the sample that I spoke with, which I think speaks to the kind of non-standardization within the market, especially in 2018. But I think there are a couple of things that are related and kind of interesting with regard to that. One is that, we all talk about the market rate like it's a rate. And there was
You mean the federal government doesn't just like, here is the market rate?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that there's this assumption, right? Everybody talks about the market rate and sort of feels comfortable that we can all assume we mean the same thing. But it was really interesting that in conversations with my respondents, that when I asked people to give me numbers, they gave me different numbers. Sometimes it was 5%, sometimes it was 6%, sometimes it was 8%. Somebody else even said 9%. And so at the same time that's not an enormous range, it points out the fact that there is, I think, a comfort with the assumptions that we have about the standardization in financial markets that is, comfortable and reliable, but that even within that, right, there is a certain amount of variability, and it just kind of gets taken for granted. So I do think that some foundations really don't seem to think a whole lot about the relationship between the, rate of return financially and the type of social impact, particularly if they're doing mission-related investments through an investment firm, for instance, right, where they've just decided an allocation that's going to go into, and not that they don't think about it, but it's just a different sort of level of consideration. And there were some other respondents in the sample who were really fascinating and who were taking more of a portfolio approach to their investments, because they were doing the work of thinking pretty seriously about the rate of return that they were getting and the type of social impact that they were seeking. And so instead of thinking about generally wanting a market rate return for all of their impact investments, they were thinking about impact investments as sort of a portfolio, even within their larger portfolio. So there was thought about, the type of social impact that they wanted to have, and that if that kind of investment could only generate a sub-market return, then within the portfolio, they were also looking for other opportunities to sort of perhaps supplement the financial, performance of the other end of the spectrum with a different type of social impact. And those were really interesting and sort of thoughtful, and I think perhaps a bit more progressed approaches to thinking about impact investments and the sort of variety of ways that you can meet your organization's needs and also create the impact that you're really seeking in the world.
So you mentioned a few of the respondents you talked to, a few of the foundations were thinking that way. Obviously, that means not all of them were. So based on the foundations that you talked to, and kind of linking back to that question of fiduciary duty, do you feel like foundations, from your small sample size, well understand the range of tools that they have within impact investing, that they don't, I guess whatever their definition of market rate is, that maybe they don't have to target that even within PRI, there's kind of a wide range. I guess how comfortable maybe do foundations feel with the wide range of impact investments they could make for different levels of return, different types of social or environmental impact, or do they feel kind of more restricted by, say, fiduciary duty on one side or charitable purpose on the other?
Yeah. I mean, I guess if I had to generalize, I think I would say that there was still a lot more reliance on fiduciary duty than sort of feeling free to experiment. I think that the knowledge around PRIs is really unique as sort of a backdrop, because PRIs have existed for a long time. And from what I know of the data, there's a Lilly School of Philanthropy report on program-related investments. But I believe what that demonstrates is that there are few foundations that have done PRIs, and they've done them for a long time, and they seem pretty comfortable with them. But it's a very small percentage of foundations that have ever really taken advantage of those. And so it's sort of interesting to have the MRIs as kind of the opposite end of the spectrum and quite new comparatively as a type of investment that one can make for social impact. So it's just a difference.
So just going back to the research that you did and kind of, stepping back a bit, was there anything that was really surprising to you out of that research?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, I was expecting a little bit more coherency in how people were thinking about their strategies, and how impact investing was structured at foundations. And there was just a really big range. It was fascinating how at a few foundations, the program staff that has, been in the business of the social impact piece for a long time were sort of inherently bound up in the impact investing work. And then there were other foundations where those two things still operated in very different places in the foundation. And the impact investments, though obviously they're also sort of made in pursuit of the mission, don't necessarily align with the programmatic priorities of the foundation. So I thought that was really interesting and surprising. And I'm curious to see, as this market grows, whether there is sort of a set of best practices about how to do that, or whether that continues to be pretty distinct. I was also surprised by a couple of respondents who were at foundations that said some really compelling and interesting things about being open to a range of returns, and thinking about their obligation as foundations and as these sort of tax exempt organizations to use the variety of tools available to them, and to think, sort of outside the box. And then one respondent said to me, how much as far as financial return goes, how much do you need? Right. So a lot of the conversation has always been around financial returns as being compared to this market threshold, the market rate, and we're comparing with all other financial investments, which is really interesting compared to social impact, right? Which is thought of much more, I think, sort of personally for foundations, right? In accordance with their mission, or the organizations that are in their local area, or that are doing work that's in line with their mission. And so that's sort of a very individual way of looking at that. And those sort of, not mismatched, but just really different approaches to sort of thinking about the box that they put the financial and social pieces of their investments in was really interesting. And she, was saying, well, we always compare all of these financial returns to this sort of standard one threshold, instead of thinking about how much we need, especially because if the money isn't going to the foundation or the organization, or it is, then it's not going someplace else in the world. And I thought that was a really interesting, unique contribution, that really pointed out that foundations don't often think about what they need to operate as a foundation or as an organization, but sort of look, as all other financial institutions do, to how the rest of the market is performing to decide whether they're being successful or not.
That's such an interesting conversation, right? You have kind of an incredibly wide definition of impact investing, or just of social impact. Like you just said, some, even within foundations and how they do grant making, right? Is it your local community? Is it international? Do you focus on environmental causes? Do you focus on human rights causes? Like we've accepted this really wide set of social impact definitions, to the point where we don't really provide a definition. We just say social impact, and we kind of assume that everybody knows what that means. And yet you take all of those things that might have investment opportunities, and you look back to one sort of standard, either standard return or expected return, even if it's concessionary, right? So we might say, like you said, market might be 5, it might be 6, 7, 8, 9. And so anything below that for the organization could be considered concessionary. You're still looking at a pretty narrow range, or that you're comparing it to. And yet, I really like the example that you used to explain PRIs, which would be a foundation providing capital to an organization they were already supporting to say, create a new building. That might be something that a foundation has closed themselves off to if they're not considering a wide range of returns.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Or it means that they're thinking about that only as being possible to come from the PRI, pot of money. Whereas if they thought about their MRI approach, a carve out from their endowment as being able to, in the big picture, return X number of dollars, but then within that, being open to sort of a range of returns that in the aggregate then produce that amount, maybe opens up other possibilities for them too.
Okay, so that makes sense. So if you're, the MRI kind of already is a carve out in a way. And so if the goal of your whole endowment is, say, to earn 8%, you could have the goal of your MRIs to return 8%, but not all of them have to return 8%. Some could return 15%, some could return 2%. So is that, was that common amongst the foundations you talked to? Were there a couple that were taking that approach?
I certainly wouldn't say that it's common. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't say that it was common. I would say that there were a few people who had really sort of seized on that portfolio approach. And I feel like I've seen more of that happening in the last few years since I've stopped data collection, but just kept watching the market. So I think that is growing. But yeah, it definitely was a smaller subset, who were thinking about their investments in that way, and that sort of big picture macro approach to the portfolio.
So you talked to a number of foundations, and I guess I'm wondering, you talked a little bit about sort of the silo of the grant makers versus the investors. Maybe the impact investing fits more with the investors. Maybe they've really brought in some of the grant makers. Was there a difference in size of an organization, like family foundation versus like small family foundation versus much larger foundation? Did any of that kind of make a difference in how, I guess, connected those things were, less siloed? What were your observations around sort of how that actual interaction went?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't assess the data in exactly that way. So I don't have, concrete numbers for you about that, but I can say that there weren't really patterns that emerged, right? Where it was, small family foundations that were doing things in a very different way. It almost seemed to me from some of the thinking about the few foundations that really did have more of the overlap between the program staff and the investment staff was that they were organizations who, before they began their impact investments, had more collaboration between their grant-making staff and their investment staff, or that they were doing PRIs prior. And so maybe they have either built their PRI program up to be larger, or they've also sort of dabbled in MRIs. But it seems like it almost had more to do with the prior structure of the foundation and the operation of the foundation and how it thought about internally achieving that mission than it did anything else.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess one of the questions that's really been on my mind that's very connected to that is like, I sort of introduced at the beginning that there isn't a lot of data about PRI. It's kind of one of the best pieces we can use around what is impact investing from foundations. But like you said, it might be 1% of the grant making, the total grant making from foundations in the US, but it's also only being done by a small number of foundations. So how do we move a small number of foundations making PRIs, a small number making MRIs, a small number making impact investments, that somehow fit into that, and sort of push the market to be just making more impact investments? Like you said, to have a broader definition of returns, to really accept that MRIs can be made within the understanding of fiduciary duty. how can the market be even pushed that direction? How do you bring foundations up to be more comfortable making PRIs, to be making MRIs? Did you, from your research, do you have any idea of like how do foundations get brought along that path?
Yeah. I mean, I think that foundations all seem like they have really individual growing up stories or growing into impact investing. A lot of that has to do with like the founder and the board and those sorts of things. So I can't really say from my sample, but I think sort of generally with regard to bringing foundations along, as I said, the foundations that were taking more of a portfolio approach, I think seemed like they felt more freedom and more agency than other respondents with regard to being able to sort of explore a range of both financial returns and social impact that they were seeking, and that they were able to then sort of hone within that the more experience that they got. And so I think that sort of openness to a variety of different kinds of investments certainly will bring them further along the spectrum. And like I said, I feel like I know it's a big leap in thought, but I think, really turning inward, some of the foundations that have thought about like what, is a reasonable expectation financially, especially when thinking about the needs that the foundation has for operating and how many dollars that takes, is a shift in, mentality. But I think that there's something there, so yeah.
Which, I mean, that very much speaks to the increase in sustainable investing in public markets. It's all behavior change. It's all human behavior change and kind of aligning with your interests, aligning with your values. It's not necessarily like an analytical financial decision. It's more of a, how are we thinking about these things in different ways? What's the impact we can make with our general investments, as well as some of these more kind of targeted impact investments that might fall under PRI, for example, for foundations. Yeah. I do wonder, it's early in it's early in the impact investing industry. It's early in the transition here in the US to more sustainable investing. I do wonder if that sort of that transition will continue and will be represented by foundations more and more in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that, foundations have been really catalytic in the US to sort of getting the impact investing market going, but, they're a smaller subset of this market. And I think that there's kind of an interesting tension that comes up a lot of times where I feel like there's a lot of language in the market about not having to compromise on financial return and being able to get, the impact that you want. And I think a lot of that is because there is this impetus to grow the market, right? And to bring more actors and more dollars in. And especially like socially neutral investors, right? Who you can't make the case on the social sort of element in order to draw them in. And so I understand that there's like a practical, pragmatic reasoning for that, but I think it's led to a lot of expectations in the market that there is never a reason to take less than a market rate return. And that you can get the same type of social impact. And while there are undoubtedly instances where you can have all of those things, I think that like there are also organizations like foundations that are, deeply socially motivated, and that I feel like it should be okay to say like for some organizations and in some areas of their portfolios that it's not a failure to take a smaller rate of return, especially for a very local or targeted, and sophisticated social impact that you literally can't achieve through some sort of outsourced market rate investment, that it's okay to have that sort of. So I feel like this language sometimes that operates at the market level that foundations are operating in almost sort of serves as a disservice, because then if you don't hold yourself to that standard, you're somehow compromising in a way that one shouldn't be. And I think that that's not true for all investors, and that should be okay.
Yeah, it is really interesting to think about. There's a continuum, and the continuum is not a false choice between you either have high social impact and low return, or low social impact and high return. That's a false continuum. But within the high social impact space, there is also a continuum of returns, and it doesn't have to be those high returns. It also doesn't have to be zero. And it is, like you said, it's really interesting to think, the role of foundations is this high social impact role. They make grants. That's a 100% negative return product. And yet a lot of foundations seem to sort of not be okay with anything in between that and market return. And there is, 108%, degrees points along that line that foundations could potentially make impact in. So there's this false continuum of high social impact and potentially low return to low or sort of socially neutral or negative impact and very high return. And that's a false spectrum. But within the social and or environmental impact, there can be a spectrum of returns. And foundations are in this unique sort of position, like you said, as they are socially motivated. They make grants, which you would consider 100% negative return for social impact. And yet all of their investments are sort of expected to be on that market, socially neutral, not necessarily that they are negative social impact. And there is this, spectrum of returns that foundations are sort of well suited to play a role in, whether that is on the PRI side, maybe it's anywhere from negative 100% to negative 50% to 0% to some, small return. Or like you said, on the mission related investment side, they could take a portfolio approach there. They could maybe take, 0, 1, 2% for high social impact. And they could, make much higher returns for social impact from other pieces of that portfolio. And so it's just interesting to think about. There's this other continuum, right? There should be social impact. You can define what your social impact is as foundation, but look at all of the potential returns you could make along with that social impact and compare the return to the impact instead of the return to some specific market return.
Totally. Yeah. I feel like it seems to me like the legacy of just operating in silos, and that the way that foundations have always worked in the past is to have produced the social impact and the financial returns in two separate, right, places within the organization. And impact investing has introduced this middle ground, this place where those things can be established together, either as a PRI or an MRI. But I think that at least what my data suggests is that there is sort of a lag in feeling comfort in that middle space because of the legitimacy that is still attached to feeling that one is acting as a prudent investor and doing what they should be doing. And there isn't really incredibly well outlined details about, what exactly it is to be a prudent investor, right? And so I think in some ways we almost need new definitions of what it means to be a legitimate fiduciary for foundations in order to be able to kind of operate comfortably in this space. At least that's what my respondents, kind of indicated to me.
So we're just about out of time. And my last kind of question for you is, so you did this research and you've continued to work in the impact investing space. So what about what you learned has sort of engaged you to continue working in the impact investing space?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is that we do have really enormous sort of social and environmental issues to be addressed, and the scale of those is enormous. And so I do think that the potential of bringing other non-charitable dollars to bear with regard to those is really compelling about impact investing. And I think that we're at a fascinating moment, right, where there is some impact washing that's happening in the space, and there is the threat of that, but there's also a lot of opportunity for a lot of good. And so I'm curious to watch the market grow and to see, how the limits of acceptability, both with regard to financial returns and social impact, are sort of narrowed, perhaps, as the market matures a little bit. So.
Well, thank you, Kirsten, for joining us. And I definitely look forward to continuing the conversation about widening the accepted expectation of return within impact investing. And we'll certainly look to see if foundations sort of continue to lead in the impact investing and social impact space, and better understand those wide ranges of returns, or maybe follow other private actors in the market that are willing to look at it as a portfolio and take those different types of risks. I think it's a really interesting space that, as we've both kind of found, foundations are uniquely suited with their wide range of tools to lead in. And so I certainly hope they do.
Yep, me too. Thanks so much for having me.